Marvelous, thank you so much. So yeah, my name is Annette Green, and I'm a postdoc currently based at the Centre for Landscape Regeneration, which is in Cambridge University. And I'm a political ecologist and human geographer. And very broadly speaking, my interest has been in how beliefs about society and nature underpin kind of conservation and restoration interventions, strategies, and decision making. So at the moment, in my role at CLR, Centre for Landscape Regeneration at Cambridge, I do social science research into diverse perspectives on land management and nature in what you might consider complex restoration landscapes in the UK. So just give me one moment. Okay, so I can't really see anyone very well at the moment now that I've started sharing my screen. So if anything
That's
goes
okay.
wrong or you
It's
can't hear
fine.
me,
No.
yeah, okay. Yeah, you'll have to say something if I cut out or something goes wrong. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit, as I said, about exploring and deliberating stakeholder perspectives in what you might consider complex restoration landscapes in the UK. And this work spans my time at the University of Cambridge, where I am at the moment, and also my previous role, which was at the University of Edinburgh, and is very much a joint effort between myself, Janet Fisher at Edinburgh, and Chris Sambrook at the University of Cambridge. So the structure today, I'm going to start off talking about the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit itself, give you a bit of a broad introduction about the rationale for doing this kind of work and where it came from, and then a bit more detail about developing the toolkit more formally with a test case real life restoration project in England. I'll then talk about some selected findings from different iterations of using the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit, the RPD toolkit, in different places. And then I'll share some feedback that we got from people who did this process with us, and also some kind of brief reflection points of my own on how I think the process went. So starting off with, as I said, a bit of a brief introduction to the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit itself and where it came from. So I think the impetus for doing this kind of work came from a recognition from my colleagues at Edinburgh and Cambridge and myself that we're expecting more and more from land in the UK. So it's a finite resource, and there's an increasing number of demands or expectations that we're placing on land to deliver on multiple fronts for people and nature. So as I try to communicate in this collage on the screen, it might be food security, clean renewable energy and energy security is an increasing issue, space for nature itself, space for nature for our own access to nature, for our health and well-being, maybe game interests, increasingly things like carbon sequestration, carbon storage, um, it, those kind of like climate mitigation and adaptation measures. We're expecting all of this from land, and there's also an increasing sense of urgency that the way that we manage land and the way that we make decisions around land needs to change and improve as soon as possible. And I think as a kind of response to this, there's been not a deluge, but let's say a flurry of landscape or restoration orientated projects, land management orientated policy mechanisms, policy instruments, strategies from different scales of government, from the national scale, like the land use framework, through to landscape recovery, top tier of elms, or local nature recovery strategies. And that's obviously impacting lots of different stakeholders. There's a lot of disagreement on how land should be managed and to what end. And again, as a kind of another response to this, I think there's been a proliferation of projects that would come under the umbrella of restoration. So projects that are trying to affect positive change for nature at this kind of bounded landscape scale, and which will invariably impact on a range of people in doing that. So a lot of different stakeholders with a lot of different perspectives on land management, how we should manage land and to what end. And so in response to this, with support from ELSP, the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes programme, we, my colleagues and I at Edinburgh, developed a social science-based toolkit for eliciting and deliberating stakeholder perspectives on land management. And that's because we believe that improving everyone's understanding of the diversity of views at stake will make restoration projects better and fairer. So that's the general rationale for this RPD Toolkit project. So these icons here are supposed to represent all of those things that I touched on in the first slide, the things that people might have opinions on and disagree with each other about when it comes to land management and nature. So things like livelihoods, housing and other infrastructure, food security, energy provision, access to nature, the role of livestock, all of these different things. So people have opinions on these things and they don't always agree with each other about them. The user that we had in mind in developing the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit was kind of this hypothetical person in the middle who we envisaged as a kind of a project manager maybe, or some kind of leader in one of these landscape scale place-based restoration projects, someone who would benefit from having a better understanding of the views of the stakeholders who they will inevitably have to work with and collaborate with to a greater or lesser extent in their landscape. So this was our hypothetical user that we were designing this approach for. So I'm not going to do a detailed deep dive into the literature that we were engaging with in the design of this approach. I'm just going to basically try and give you a flavour of some of the principles that we were thinking about and theories that we had in mind or were drawing from in doing this work. So I'm going to kind of throw some kind of excerpts at you, just little snippets from these three key pieces of literature that should give you an idea. So we were thinking in the design of the RPD toolkit about the empowerment, freedom, voice and control of the stakeholders in landscape scale restoration projects. So for the people who would be potentially impacted by change in their landscape, and thinking about their status and recognition, dignity and respect. Accepting the legitimacy of the claims of opponents. So we wanted to support people to move into that space where they could accept the legitimacy of opinions that they didn't agree with. Similarly, embracing diversity of ideas, including ones that exist in tension with or directly challenge our own. And trying to get people to move to being adversaries rather than enemies with the people who they don't agree with. So these are ideas that are taken from political science, conflict and conflict management, particularly in conservation, value diversity and plurality, and interdisciplinary conservation. So these are the kind of ideas that we took from this broad body of literature. And if I was going to sum it up extremely succinctly, our kind of guiding principle would be something along the lines of disagreement isn't necessarily bad, and by the same token, consensus isn't necessarily good. It's more about kind of managing the social and political processes around disagreement and consensus building. So how did we go about doing that in a kind of material way, in a tangible way? What did we actually do? So we designed the toolkit to have two parts. As good social scientists, we included a survey, of course. So we've got a survey. It's quite low tech for generating indicative data on perspectives, on the perspectives of stakeholders. So a survey for perspective elicitation. And then the all important second part is a workshop structure for perspective deliberation. So that's really what the toolkit comprises, these two parts, the survey and the proposed workshop structure. And that is what we designed. So going on to part 1B of the seminar, I'll talk to you about the more detailed side of developing and testing out the RPD toolkit, this format, with our test case restoration project. So for the RPD toolkit test case, we were working in Cumbria with a project called Cumbria Connect. And this is a project that is funded by, like our project was, but through a separate funding stream, the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes programme. It's one of their restoration landscape projects. So this is about actually affecting material, tangible change on the ground in terms of how land is managed in place. It's based in Eastern Cumbria, which is in northwest England. RSPB was the project lead, and they were partnering with non and quasi-governmental organisations. So Natural England, United Utilities, so they provide water for the northwest, and the Lowther estate, which is a quite significant land owning entity in Eastern Cumbria. So a major player there when it comes to land management. And the project was aiming for the restoration of 33,000 hectares of English upland landscape. That's the kind of headline aim of this project. With farmers, of course, as a major stakeholder group. So there's a lot of upland hill farming going on in this part of Cumbria. And as I'm sure the people who are here for this seminar are probably already aware, there is a lot of debate and disagreement about how land should be managed in Cumbria. It often plays out in the pages of broadsheet newspapers and comment pieces, and it's presented as this kind of sheep farmer versus restorationist kind of dynamic. So there's disagreement there. There's been conflict in the past that's been quite live. And as you can imagine, therefore, it was quite a juicy kind of landscape for someone like me, for people like me and my colleagues who were interested in diverse stakeholder perspectives. There's certainly diverse perspectives in this particular part, corner of the UK. So developing the survey in Cumbria, we had particular survey requirements that might make it a bit different from other surveys that you've maybe participated in or been involved in designing. So the most important thing is that we wanted this survey to generate data which would structure or stimulate discussion in stakeholder workshops. So we weren't designing the survey as a standalone data collection method. It very much is intrinsically linked to the second part, the deliberative workshop part of the process. We wanted it to be short, so it would be manageable, deliverable online or in person, a simple format, and usable independently by non-social scientists eventually. And so based on these requirements, we made the survey like-it-based. Again, I'm sure this is something that you're familiar with. So you have a stimulus, in this case, a statement, and then you invite your participants to indicate their level of agreement with the statement, in this case, on a 5-point scale from disagree strongly all the way through to agree strongly. So that was the format that we decided our survey would be in. We then had to go about generating statements for the survey. So I think because this was our test case and our first kind of iteration of the RPD toolkit, my colleagues and I were quite involved in collecting additional data and involved in the social science design of the data collection. But it's really what we were aiming for, as I said, was to design a process that could be used by people who weren't social scientists or didn't have much already training in social sciences. So this might not apply or might not be necessary for other potential users of this RPD approach, but this is what we did in this particular case in Cumbria. So we started off, I was collecting primary data from interviews, mainly with farmers, so that I could be confident that I was aware of what the most pressing live issues, concerns were for this extremely important group of stakeholders. And then I also did collected secondary data from literature review. So this was stuff like project documents from the project itself, academic literature, blog posts, books, headlines, as I already mentioned, comment pieces, and often it was very telling looking at the comments below the line as well to see where people were really disagreeing with each other. And really this was about me kind of immersing myself in and becoming familiar with the historic and the live debates about land management in this part of the UK. And then from the totality of that primary and secondary data, that then went through a process of distillation, let's say, which was mainly done by me and my colleagues at Edinburgh and Cambridge, but also doing some sense checking with people who were within the Cumbria Connect project, just to make sure that there weren't any glaring gaps or particularly sensitive subjects or poorly phrased statements, for example. So from that process, we then ended up with 30 statements about salient issues in restoration and land management in the Cumbria Connect landscape that we then took forward into our final survey. So 30 statements. And this is just an example statement. So I would like to see more diverse tree species in this landscape. That's your statement, that's your stimulus. And then you have your categories from disagree strongly through to agree strongly. And your respondents have to choose one, and they can only choose one. And this is what the format was like for all 30 statements. And we just did it on Microsoft Forms. We had 49 respondents to the survey in the end. And we had decided that we wanted to focus on high impact, high influence land management stakeholders in this part of Cumbria. And we knew also that what we needed to do was to collect data from people who were likely to have a diversity of perspectives on how land should be managed. So it was more important to get diverse responses from people than it was to get a high number of responses. As I said, it's not the survey bit isn't a standalone data collection method, and it's not there to make, to identify trends. It's about capturing diversity. And so we decided that the diversity that we needed to explore would be based on their professional backgrounds. So kind of hypothesizing that people who were from a farming background were likely to have different perspectives and priorities on land management and nature from someone who worked for RSPB, which would be different again from someone who worked for Friends of the Lake District, for example. So we gathered this very basic demographic data on our respondents' professional backgrounds. So this is what our kind of respondents looked like in terms of their in terms of their professional backgrounds. So the first group that we'd identified as being important to target for this process, high influence, high interest stakeholders, were farmers. So in the survey, we split that into people who were farming on their own farm and then farming other, which was contractors or labourers. So that's the first group. The second group was people whose professional background was in conservation or restoration, then heritage or culture, which would be, as I said, like Friends of the Lake District or maybe the National Trust, and then estate or land management, which is this kind of catch-all term for people who are involved in, for example, United Utilities or the Lowther Estate. So they're not farmers, they're not conservationists, but they are major landowners, and they have obviously high interest and high influence in how land is managed. And then the other category for people who felt like they didn't fit into any of these four categories that we'd identified as being most important. But often it was people who said things like, well, I work for Natural England, or I used to work for Natural England, but my partner is a farmer and I'm from a farming family, and I also consider myself to be a farmer, for example. So a word on the sampling, it was highly targeted. As I said, it was more important to get the kind of responses from the right kind of people than it was to get a high number of responses. So the sampling was mainly done, as I said, it's purposively a lot of individual invitations from me and then a bit of snowball sampling as well to supplement that. So really 49 is probably kind of more than we needed for doing this kind of exercise, but we were happy with 49 responses. The responses included people from the constituent organisations of Cumbria Connect and wider stakeholders as well. So that's important to note. People who were actually staff members on the project or working for those partnership organisations, we gathered data from them too. They are also stakeholders. And as I've already said, it's not a statistically representative sample. It's not a random sample. I think of it more as taking on a kind of qualitative sampling strategy that just happens to have some numbers attached to it. That's kind of how I think of it. So, as I said earlier, we had 30 statements in the final survey. We had 49 completed surveys from these groups that I mentioned: farming, restoration, heritage, and estates. And then I'm just going to go through with you 2 results from this case study, this test case in Cumbria with the Cumbria Connect project. So 2 real results just to show to you the kind of data that you can get from doing this kind of exercise. So this is a real statement from the survey. The statement is, it is important to me that this landscape helps provide clean and safe water. So what this visualization shows is that 93.9% of the respondents agreed, light blue, or agreed strongly, dark blue, with the statement. So this big area of blue here. And 0%, none of the respondents disagreed. So we don't have any orange or red on this slide. So we don't have anyone disagreeing with the statement. So you can see that what this visualization communicates to you quite quickly is that not only are the respondents agreeing with the statement, they're also agreeing with each other. So you've got these big areas of blue and they're all kind of like pulling over to the same side of the screen. The respondents are aligned in their responses to this statement. And then compare that to this statement. I believe that farming provides more livelihood opportunities than restoration ever could. Again, you can see kind of straight away just from looking at this set of results, it's a completely different set of responses. You've got responses from across all 5 categories, from disagree strongly all the way through to agree strongly. They're fairly evenly distributed. And yeah, just a completely different set of responses. All of the colours represented there. But in addition to just looking at these visualizations and eyeballing them, so these are the visualizations that are generated if you use the RPD toolkit. The RPD toolkit process will also calculate for you consensus index scores. So this is a process from statisticians, Tassel and Weirman, for using Likert data and identifying kind of consensus information from that. So you can calculate a consensus index score for your data in response to each statement of between 0 and 1. So if I remember correctly, a score of 0 would be if you had, say, 50% of the respondents saying agree strongly and 50% saying disagree strongly. That's the most polarized that data set could possibly be, and you would get the lowest consensus index score. And you would get a score of 1 full consensus if all of your respondents responded to the same category of agreement. So if they all said that they agreed strongly, or they all said they disagreed strongly, or they all went in the middle, that would be 1. So yeah, lower consensus 0, higher consensus 1. So for this statement about water provision, the consensus index score is 0.798, whereas for this statement about farming versus restoration livelihoods, it's 0.485. So relatively, it's quite a lot lower. And in turn, we use that data to then suggest to us which issues are likely to be kind of consensus issues, where your respondents might find it a bit easier to find common ground with each other, maybe build on that and reach a more specific agreement on something else, some intervention. And then by the same token, the lower consensus index score suggests, is this an area where your stakeholders in your landscape might find it harder to agree with each other, harder to find common ground, and potentially risk being in conflict with each other over this statement? Okay, so you get these consensus index scores for each of the statements in your survey, in this case, 30 statements. And then, as I said, we then come to the all-important second part. So this is not a standalone data collection method. This is the kind of information that is going to inform and feed into our deliberative workshops. So in our test case, we did deliberative workshops in Cumbria in August 2023, 2 evening sessions in Bampton in Eastern Cumbria. And we had workshop participants from the same stakeholder groups who were targeted for the survey. So not necessarily the same individuals, although there was some overlap, but you were aiming for the same kind of groups being represented in your workshop as represented in your survey. So farming, restoration, heritage and estates for us. We also had workshop participants from Cumbria Connect project and its constituent organisations. So from this partnership, from the project and its partnership organisations, so that they could participate in exactly the same way as any of the other stakeholders who were there. And, you know, be there as participants and not as conveners or leaders or observers of the workshop. On that note, you know, we had the workshops led by an independent facilitator. That was really helpful because it freed up mine and Janet's brain space to be co-facilitators and observers of the process. And also, I think it was quite important symbolically to see that there was someone in charge of the process who didn't have any skin in the game, didn't have any real interest in the Cumbria Connect project itself. So that was super helpful. And we did small group activities based on survey results. So those small group activities were the first activity that we did in our small groups was we asked people to discuss with each other which results were as expected and which were surprising. So you can see in this picture here, that's Janet Fisher from Edinburgh University, who was the PI on the project. In their small groups, people were given individual handouts of the full set of survey results to look at and chew over and think about in a bit more detail. And this discussion prompt really was just to help people get their eye in, get used to looking at the data, make sure that they kind of understood what they were looking at, because it is complicated and it's quite overwhelming to get the full set all in one go. And also it gave them the freedom to kind of raise the things that they thought were most interesting. We then gave each group one consensus statement to discuss in more detail, so one of the statements with a higher consensus score, and asked them, given that we have a relatively high level of consensus among each other on this statement, how can we make positive changes with regards to this issue, or are there any barriers to that? And then we also gave people 3 of the more divisive statements, so with the lower consensus scores, kind of one by one, and asked them to discuss what challenges might arise, if any. Maybe there wouldn't be any challenges. What challenges might arise, if any, from people disagreeing with each other about this issue? So really those exercises were all intended to try and get people to be curious about each other, to acknowledge those areas of disagreement, and not kind of shy away from them and hide from them, but to be able to discuss them, but in a way that was maybe a bit depersonalized, because they could talk to each other through the results of the survey. And it kind of brought a different tone to the conversation than maybe they were, maybe might have experienced in the past, or what they might have expected on the night. And then the final workshop activity was a plenary discussion. So everyone brought back together and asked, if we are to work better together to benefit everyone who cares about this place, what areas should we focus on? So in this exercise, really, we wanted to finish on quite a forward-facing note, but also, quite a reflective and introspective one. We were asking people to reflect on the conversations that they'd had and think, okay, is there anything that we can take forward as individuals, as a group, practical ideas, things that they'd learn, and just finish on a slightly forward-facing and hopefully slightly positive note as well. And the aim of all of those activities, as I alluded to just now, really was to get participants to think from someone else's perspective and to reflect critically on their own as well. So I'm just going to go through some selected findings now. So some empirical data, mainly from the Cumbria Connect test case, but also from another iteration of this toolkit, a much more recent one. So just to recap, you've got your survey for perspective elicitation that generates data like this and flags areas where people tend to agree and where they tend to disagree with each other, as suggested by the survey results. And then in the deliberative workshops, you take those survey results, hand them over to your group of participants, and ask them to help you interpret the survey results. And in doing that, they learn about and from each other. So I did that with the projects that I'm going to talk to you about today. Will be one in the Cumbria Connect project, the one that I've just been talking to you about, the test case project, and then also some experiences of doing this kind of process in the Cambridgeshire Fens, which is a very, very different context and set of experiences. So some selected findings from the Cumbria Connect, the test case. So one finding that I think was quite important to raise, even though it might seem obvious to a lot of the people who are gathered here today. Farmers do not lack knowledge or understanding on issues pertaining to conservation, nor do they object to it per se. Now, as I said, that might be obvious to a lot of people who are here today, but I think it was genuinely somewhat surprising for some of the people who were from, say, within the project, or who were close to the project, or from those constituent organisations. So this is really borne out by the indicative results from the survey. So these statements: farming should contribute to nature restoration in this landscape. Farms in this landscape can be part of the solution for tackling climate change, and farms in this landscape can be part of the solution for tackling biodiversity loss. For the respondents who did the survey, at least a third of whom we know were farmers, they're agreeing with that. So there's at least in principle, in the abstract, farmers believe in the importance of their farm for supporting nature and the potential for them to help biodiversity loss and tackle climate change. So that I think was, as I said, it was a bit of a surprise to some of the people who attended the workshops, and they took it as a real positive, a good finding. The issue that then emerged from interviews that I did and from the workshops as well was that farmers might have issues with conservationists collectively, or conservation and restoration as a kind of sector or an industry. And that will be based on their personal experiences or historical experiences with projects, individual organizations, and even individuals within organizations in the past, and a very strong sense that a lot of farmers have, that they're not included properly in restoration processes, that they're not listened to, that they're not really respected, and that a lot of professionals will come into a landscape as kind of newcomers with very fixed ideas about what they want to do to the land and why, and that there's no kind of give or flexibility there. You know, farmers in interviews and workshops spoke about things like the green agenda, or people being very blinkered or fanatical. You know, these are kind of direct these are the actual words that farmers were using to describe some of their peers from the restoration and conservation sector. Closely related, farmers feel that the uneven power dynamic between different groups in this landscape limits their autonomy. So certainly, okay, so this is the result from the survey. So we had a statement: unequal power between different interest groups is an important factor influencing land use here. So most people are agreeing with it. You've got this, you know, significant minority of people who are neither agree nor disagree. And I think that even though most people agree that, yeah, there's unequal power dynamics going on in land use decision making and management in Eastern Cumbria, in the Cumbria Connect landscape, what people don't agree on is kind of who the powerful and less powerful entities are. And farmers certainly feel like they're not powerful. And as I said, you know, alluded to in the previous slide, feeling like they're not listened to, they haven't been heard or respected or acknowledged by their kind of counterparts in conservation and restoration. So this is a direct quotation from an interview, one of the interviews I did in preparation in the build up to the design of the RPD toolkit. So this farmer said, "It's becoming more and more apparent, especially recently, that whatever I think or feel is irrelevant." So this is, you know, this is quite an extreme statement, and this is someone who is talking to me from a place of real disengagement with the process, no interest in engaging with restoration processes, real disillusionment with agri-environment schemes, difficulty in finding agreements on whether to participate on agri-environment schemes and what they might look like on common land where he has grazing rights. And this is someone who isn't at all connected with or engaging with the Cumbria Connect project. He's in the Cumbria Connect project area. He knows what it is. He knows who the people are, and he's not interested. And then this farmer, interviewee number one, said, "I'm sure a lot of the people I meet would rather there wasn't a farmer on the land." Again, this is another farmer who feels dejected, disillusioned, kind of disengaged from the process, but actually, unlike interviewee number 12, is actually part of it, is signed up to some kind of in principle collaboration with their land on through Cumbria Connect or other restoration projects in the land, but certainly not doing so enthusiastically. And I think that there's a bit of a risk there that farmers, I think there's a risk that people who are involved in conservation, restoration, and trying to get farmers involved in their projects and schemes believe that once they're signed up, everything is okay. But actually, a lot of farmers feel like they participate in these kind of projects because they don't really have any other alternative or choice, or they've been pressured into doing that. They're not doing so willingly or gladly. They don't feel respected or wanted in the landscape. And really that is kind of undermining your potential for long-term change or transformative change, potentially. Changes to the wider landscape impacts farmers practically and emotionally / psychologically. So again, this is something that I think maybe some stakeholders don't fully appreciate. So changes to the land surrounding a farm leads to change on one's own on-farm land management. So this is in a very practical and material sense. For example, interviewees that I spoke to mentioned something like, if a neighbour goes into a scheme, that means that they in this particular example, they described losing access to grazing land that they'd relied on for however many years at certain times of the year. So because their neighbour had gone into the scheme, they no longer had access to that and now had to think about off-wintering their sheep, or their sheep were suffering as a consequence. And so that's an example of like, it's very possible that an individual farmer or a farmstead would choose not to participate in a scheme or be involved in a project, but would nonetheless really be impacted by it in a very real material sense. And then on the emotional or psychological side, the wider landscape is connected to many farmers' sense of self, so their sense of who they are and their identity. And I'm in the process of, I'm nearly kind of finalised writing up a paper that explores the place-based dimensions of farmers' identity. And I've kind of been dipping my toe into environmental psychology literature, which is really interesting. And really, that comes down to this statement here from the survey. So I am concerned that there will no longer be a place for me in this landscape if it changes too much. So again, you can see, like, this was the statement that had the lowest consensus index score of all. It was 0.3 something, I think, off the top of my head. And what this communicates to me, or really drives home to me, is that it just really highlights how different the stakes are for the different stakeholders when it comes to land use change in this part of the UK. So almost half of the people who did the survey say that they're not really, they're either not making a connection between the landscape and their sense of belonging, or they don't think that a change in the landscape will impact their sense of belonging in it. Whereas, you know, over a third of the respondents say that they are worried that there won't be a place for them in the landscape if it changes too much. So it's just two groups of people who are approaching the landscape and how you would manage change or affect change in the landscape in completely different ways with completely different consequences. And for some people, changes to the landscape will result in potentially kind of emotional or psychological injury. You know, it feels quite existential, is what I'm trying to say. And this is illustrated by this little excerpt from interviewee number 1, who's from the previous slide, a farmer who said, "To see a fell empty of sheep, it effing hurts." So I can't really sum it up any better than that. As I said, it feels like an injury, like emotional pain for some people to see landscape changing around them and feel like there isn't anything that they can do about it, and it's reflecting on their sense of who they are as a person. So completely different set of findings now, really different context. So this is an iteration of the RPD toolkit approach that I used in the Cambridgeshire Fens. I need to caveat this by saying I only did this data collection, finished this data collection in December last year. So it's very fresh and there isn't much in-depth analysis, but I'm basically just going to use it as an example of another way that you can use the RPD toolkit and collect, and it has flexibility built into it, and you can get different kinds of data and different kinds of findings. So the first thing to say is that obviously the Cambridgeshire Fens is a really different context from Eastern Cumbria. There's no upland, there's no, Swaledale sheep or commons or anything like that. It's very flat, as the eye can see. It's arable farming, it's high-tech big farms. It produces some ridiculous proportion of the salad and vegetable crops that we eat in the UK. It's 30 or 40% or something mad like that. So extremely productive landscape. It was artificially drained in the 1600s, 1700s, and it's peat soil, which is why it's so productive. But the peat is shrinking, there's peat wastage, it's releasing carbon into the atmosphere. It's a very water-stressed area, and also Cambridgeshire is socioeconomically extremely unequal. So this is the kind of context that I was going into in the Cambridgeshire Fens. So this is just a map of Cambridgeshire for people who might not know Cambridgeshire very well. So I focused on the historical county of Cambridgeshire for this research. So that's not including Peterborough, so ignore Peterborough. And I basically focused on collecting data from stakeholders in these 5 districts in the historic county of Cambridgeshire. So Fenland, Huntingdonshire, East Cambs, South Cambs, and Cambridge City. And another major difference between this data collection between this kind of period of research and the Cumbria Connect one is that there wasn't any specific one project that I could kind of hook people in with, which did have implications for the data collection. And what I did instead was I wanted to gather data from stakeholders across this whole district, two groups. So the first group being the local government group, which was mainly elected government representatives at the parish or town council level. So that's the lowest possible level of government in England, who theoretically would have a good understanding of very place-based concerns and what's important to their constituents that they've been elected to represent. And then the second group I was targeting was people from, I was calling it the kind of non or quasi-governmental group, which was people who work for organisations who are working or looking at the Fens in a more landscape or strategic scale. So that might be people like, or organisations like Anglia Water, the drainage boards, maybe RSPB, who work across the Fens in different locations and are involved in protected area management, same with the National Trust, people who are more involved in planning, people at the higher tiers of local government, like the district level. So you've got the hyper-local and the kind of strategic scale. They're the two halves of my sample that I wanted to collect. And I did 5 kind of regional hub workshops after I gathered the survey data from people across these 5 districts. So yeah, and in each workshop, I just had one group of people, so no small groups. It was just me doing a kind of focus group in each of the 5 workshops. So quite a different way of using the RPD approach there. So this is one result from the survey. So I had 67 responses and it was roughly half local government and half like strategic landscape scale, non-governmental types, which is exactly what I wanted. So the statement is climate change is a serious risk to people and jobs in the Cambridgeshire Fens. Most people agree with this. You've got nearly 80% of the respondents saying that they agree. In the workshops, quite a few people expressed surprise that even 7.5% would disagree that climate change is a serious risk to people in the Fens. The people who were there attending the workshops saw climate change as a very real and potentially very imminent threat to lives and livelihoods in the Fens. We're talking about flooding, catastrophic saltwater inundation. It's below sea level. The water management is constant. It's a very water stressed area. Yeah, so for these people, climate change is a big and kind of imminent threat to people. What emerged from conversations around climate change was it really drove home for me this kind of north-south divide between it that happens within Cambridgeshire. As I said, it's an extremely unequal area, and in fact the Fenland district up here in the north of Cambridgeshire is one of the most deprived local authority areas in the whole of England. They have very poor outcomes in terms of education and access to further and higher education facilities, and income is low. What else? Health outcomes are very bad. So just living completely different lives from people who are in Cambridge City and South Cambridgeshire. So on this north-south divide, I'm just going to throw out some quotations, some excerpts, direct quotations from the workshop. So in the Cambridge City workshop I did, an ecologist for an ENGO made this kind of quite sweeping statement that Fenland District Council don't believe in climate change. This came up a lot of projection that people in the north of the county, people in Fenland District don't believe in climate change deniers kind of thing. And then interestingly, someone who was at one of the Fenland workshops in a town called March said, looking at local elections, a large proportion of people in the area voted for the party that doesn't really believe in climate change or things like that. I think that's reform is the implication there. So I think that indicates that, you know, the environment and climate maybe isn't seen as an important thing by lots of people locally. And then similarly, you know, in keeping with this theme, at the Huntingdon workshop, a chair of a local nature partnership said that he felt like environmental projects were seen as being the concern of middle-class people living in South Cambridgeshire. So that's a direct quotation. And sorry, it's not very clear from this, but this person in the Huntingdon workshop was saying that he thinks that people in the north of the county, in Fenland, for example, think that environmental projects are the concern of middle-class people living in South Cambridgeshire. So a lot of projection, a lot of assumptions going on about what people in different parts of the district think and what they prioritise and what they know and what they don't know and what they're wrong about. A lot of that going on across the different workshops. And it was a really similar dynamic with the discussions around this statement as well, actually. So statement 4, we should help people before we start helping nature in the Cambridgeshire Fens. Big chunk of people who say, yeah, that 40% of the people who are in the neither agree nor disagree category for this. And then in the workshops, people were saying things like, okay, so this someone from the Cambridge City Workshop, a community officer at an NGO, said, I'm a bit guilty of this myself. We need to cut Fenland District Council some slack, actually. They are managing an area which has got some serious deprivation going on. Actually, you need to be in a comfortable place, or the majority of people need to be in a comfortable place before they can start looking at nature, because nature is seen as a bit of a luxury. So this is a bit of empathy building and mutual understanding building, and someone standing up for their counterparts in, or their peers in Fenland District Council, and recognising the reality that they face is completely different. Like sometimes people were talking like Fenland, like was like on another planet or something. Like it could be quite extreme. And similarly, the people who were in the Fenland workshops were saying things like they felt like they could be quite ignored, or they were being lost. They felt very distant from Cambridge City. They didn't really feel like they were part of Cambridgeshire, but they were also not really part of Norfolk or Lincolnshire either, feeling very isolated. And then I think this is borne out by this quotation from someone from the Whiz Beach workshop, again in Fenland District. This person was saying, we've not got the education, we've not got the know-how. Okay, so this is, again, this issue to do with lack of access to educational facilities. I've lived in Fenland all my life, and Fenland people are only affected by what they can see and what is happening in front of them. Just the state of our education systems around here and things like that are just way off where they should be. So they're really not as good. They're not where they should be in Fenland, and we don't have the right kind of access to facilities. That's what people in Fenland feel. Families have got enough problems to worry about that, frankly, too much rain, too dry is very low on their agenda. So again, that's kind of corroborating what this person, I think that these people across these different workshops are actually probably in some kind of meta agreement with each other, and that they appreciate that that different parts of Cambridge have faced very different socioeconomic realities, and therefore their assumptions about and relationship with the importance of nature and climate change are going to be very, very diverse. But what I thought was a shame is that these people weren't coming into contact with each other at the workshops that I did, because I didn't do just one single workshop that would have, theoretically would have brought all of these different disagreeing voices together and given them that chance to have that kind of productive disagreement, productive friction that I spoke about at the very beginning of the seminar, the principles that fed into the design of the RPD toolkit. But that's just a function of the research, design and reality, I think, because I think if I hadn't gone up to Fenland District and done a workshop in March and done a workshop in Whiz Beach, they would have just felt like even they all, like a lot of people up in Fenland already feel like they're not included and they're not listened to and consulted in processes, and they're just kind of cut off from things that happen in the south of the county anyway. So I had to go up there to do the workshops, but it then meant that that there wasn't any kind of mixing going on between these people who would hopefully be able to disagree with each other and learn from each other through the RPD process. So anyway, that's kind of straying into this kind of reflection bit anyway, which is going to be the last bit of the seminar with the last few minutes that I've got. So just to bring it back to the very beginning of the workshop, as I've just mentioned, those principles, the theories, the concepts that we were trying to draw on and keep in mind in our design of the process, meeting people's psychological unmet needs to feel heard, acknowledged, understood by their peers, freedom, voice and control, accepting legitimacy of opponents, divertive ideas, all that stuff. Try to operationalize that with the survey, the workshops, etc. So how did we kind of do? Well, I think the feedback that we got from each of these two processes is, I think, quite illustrative. So the feedback immediately after the workshops in Cumbria Connect said things like, this is in anonymous feedback forms, mention the opportunity to unpack controversial issues, get under the skin about what others' concerns, issues, worries are, helps to understand the way we obviously see things completely differently at times, allowing me to appreciate where others are coming from, non-confrontational. So that's great. That's exactly the kind of feedback that we would have wanted. You know, it maps up really well with our kind of initial principles and the things that we wanted to generate, and that experiential side of going through the RPD process. It hit all those buttons. We felt like we had a great kind of proof of concept for this process. In the Cambridgeshire Fens, I got good feedback from going through the process overall. But the good feedback said things like, it was good having a good variety of professional backgrounds because this helped with the feedback on the responses. So the survey responses, interpreting the survey results. And that there was a variety of people there, useful insight into attitudes towards the Fens. It was stuff like that. So it was good feedback, but it wasn't quite hitting those objectives we were aiming for, those experiential objectives of productive disagreement and gaining insight, empathy, mutual understanding across different peer groups. And as I said, I think that's probably a function of the research design, but hopefully I'll still be able to pull something interesting and useful out of that Fens data collection that I did. And even if it's just emphasizing that there is that north-south divide and trying to encourage people to come together more in kind of neutral fora, like, you know, workshops and things like that. But I understand that on a practical level, it's just very difficult to do. And I think that's where the Cambridgeshire Fens iteration of the RPD toolkit maybe went less well than I would have liked it to, even though for me it generated really interesting and rich data as a researcher. So yeah, I'll finish there. And anyone that wants more information on the Restoration Partnership Development Toolkit, you can email me. That's me. You can get in touch with Janet, who is a permanent member of staff at Edinburgh, and works on this. And you can follow the QR code or the links here. So yeah, just get in touch anytime, anyone that's got any questions. And thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette. So we really have to get on to the questions because we only have a few minutes left. So Julie, would you like to take it over, please?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Tony, I don't know if you're there in person, you'd like to ask it, or I can just read it out for you. No response, and I'll read it anyway. Are there further strategies needed for establishing thresholds for either consensus or conflict? Because there are a lot of different participating stakeholder groups.
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. If you wanted to read it, it's in the chat as well.
Oh, yeah.
So are there further strategies needed
for establishing thresholds for either consensus or conflict, because there are lots of different participating states? Potentially, I think that's possibly something, if we're talking about in a statistical way or kind of trying to put a number on or some limit or threshold on those consensus index scores, that might be possible, but it's probably beyond my kind of skill set because I'm not a stats person. I'm very much a qualitative researcher that does bits of quantitative research in particular contexts. But I would say the consensus index scores, I think you just have to treat them relatively. Like if you were a user of the RPD toolkit, you would have, it would produce all of the statements that are in your final survey ordered by consensus index score. So the one with the highest consensus index score at the top and the lowest at the bottom. And I think you just have to look at them relatively and see, okay, which are the ones that have the highest level of consensus and which are the ones that have the lowest. And in terms of whether you could say like, oh, a score below 4 is very low consensus or a score above 8 is high or whatever, that's probably, yeah, that's not something that I would really be able to answer well, I don't think.
Okay. I just had a question, which I'm going to be cheeky and fit in here because it's about the method before going on to Molly's. It seems very, I mean, it's a great example and a great tool, and I think we all recognise a lot of that activity and that conflict. But we also struggle to represent different people's ideas and tend to talk up a lot of the time to the usual suspects. And I think with the tool, to what extent is it contingent on who you talk to in the first place and how you select them? I mean, you did talk about your farmers. We had one representing disengagement completely from the project, and another one who was kind of there by perhaps a gesture of being there, but not really engaged. So
yeah, I think
is that an area that potentially needs thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a question that was raised quite a lot in the Cambridgeshire Fens workshops in particular. People were saying things like, isn't this a self-selecting group of people, and that's going to skew the results of the data? And people who are less engaged or don't care about nature so much just won't have done the survey because they're just not interested in it. And I think that that's true, and that's just I try to kind of mitigate against that. And when I was inviting people to do the surveys in Cambridgeshire, to make it clear, like, you don't already have to be, especially for this is particularly for the local government group, like, you don't already have to be like on your, nature recovery, your kind of neighbourhood biodiversity committee or involved in access to nature or any of those other things to participate in the survey. But it's just a fact that the people who are already interested in it are the most likely to engage. And I think the way to overcome that is just the kind of usual social science methods of just, trying to extend your networks as much as possible, snowball sampling, all of the general kind of stakeholder mapping exercises that you would do for any kind of social science data collection. And then if there are any gaps or uncertainties there, you just have to be upfront and honest about that. But I don't think that necessarily undermines the whole process, provided you are honest about that, especially at the beginning of workshops. And then, you can caveat but it doesn't need to stop the workshop discussions being productive, because it will still should indicate the directions that people are pulling in. As I said, it's generating that indicative data rather than a standalone data collection method that identifies trends very accurately. But there's a lot of material about that in the guidance manual that comes with the toolkit. Yeah.
I'm sorry, there isn't a huge amount of time, so I've got two questions that I can see. There's one from Molly and then one from Pippa. So Molly's effectively asking, has the toolkit been applied in helping with ocean or marine governance contexts that you're aware of?
Not that I am aware of for sure, but I did do a much shorter version of a talk like this for ELSP Seascapes grantees last year around the spring. So I know that they are aware of that, and they seemed to believe like it would be possible and potentially useful in the kind of oceans government and seascapes context, but I don't know for sure whether anyone actually picked it up and used it. Yeah.
All right. Well, Molly can maybe follow up on that.
Gladly. Yeah. If anyone wants to follow up on anything, that's great.
And Pippa, over to you.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, Annette. Thank you. It's a really interesting presentation, and I think it speaks to some of the things that we're thinking about here at the CCRI around consensus and the limits to consensus and what we might gain from adopting more sort of procedures that embrace agonism a little bit more. I just had a very practical facilitation question, which is, did you have a procedure for setting this kind of ground rules, so to speak, or the expectations around conduct in the workshops to manage things that could be fairly contentious?
We did the usual kind of, and especially with the independent facilitator was great at that, because that's his job and that's his professional and that's what he does for a living, was really good at setting the tone and setting out the specifics of what respectful engagement might look like. And then in a more toolkit related way, we basically just encouraged people to focus on the results of not to focus on the results of the survey, but use the results of the survey as a tool. So we encourage people to hypothesize about why someone might agree or disagree with a statement, regardless of whether they personally agreed or disagreed with the statement, and pick out things that they thought were interesting, as I said, expected or unexpected dynamics in the results of the survey. And that was based on this idea of the survey being like a third object in the room. And there's a paper that we drew on from I guess I can share the slides and some references so that you'll have some reference points to look this up. But the idea of the third object originally came from education and psychology, and it was about bringing something into an interview setting that would kind of draw focus and draw attention and allow the interviewee to talk about potentially challenging topics, because they were talking like through this object, whatever it is, and talking about what it brought up for them. And we kind of just tried to apply that and say the results of the survey can act as that third object. It can create a kind of third discursive space, if you like, in which kind of unexpected, to create kind of new and unexpected social interactions, particularly around challenging topics of conversation. Like, we knew that some of those debates were very live and that there had been conflict historically and recently in that area. And I think talking through the results of the survey, and as I said, talking hypothetically, helped people to go into, it helped people to avoid going into kind of personally attacking and defensive roles. You know, they could talk about why someone might feel a particular way, rather than saying, I believe this, and I now have to convince you why I'm right and you're wrong. So the short version of that answer is, you know, we had the kind of usual ground rules for respectful engagement, and then the survey results themselves also provided a bit of structure that would kind of really help to do that respectful engagement in a practical way.
Brilliant.
Excellent, thank you. I'm sorry we're going to have to end it there, but that was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much, Annette, and really useful. And I'm sure CCRI folk will be in touch with you independently after this with lots more questions.